Welcome back to F1's Most Horrific Crashes, a series where we shall be taking a detailed look into some of the most severe accidents in the history of F1. In our last episode, we looked at some of the most tragic fatalities the sport has ever seen, but in this third episode, we shall once again be looking at more non-fatal accidents. Just like last time, I will warn you that this video contains footage and photos of graphic injury, and whilst no fatal accidents are shown, they are sometimes spoken about. Formula One car construction has come a long way in the last several decades. Modern cars are built around a carbon fibre composite monocoque chassis with hundreds of people in each team working tirelessly behind the scenes, designing, building and maintaining these machines. In 1950, things were very different. Most, if not all, of the cars that year were built using the relatively new tubular space frame chassis design, which itself was a development of the common ladder chassis, with the rest of the car being bashed together in the hopes of building a successful car. As speeds increased, the space frame became less reliable, as would twist and flex, leading to failure later on. In 1962, the Lotus 25 was introduced with the first aluminium monocoque chassis. Stronger, lighter and more streamlined, this chassis design would become the mainstay for F1 car designs right up until today. Monocoque is the French word for single shell, and everything in a car's construction was built around and within this shell. But once again, as speeds increased and aluminium wasn't enough to protect the driver, designers had to look for a new solution. For the 1981 season, McLaren introduced the MP4-1. Designed by famed engineers John Barnard, Steve Nichols and Alan Jenkins, not only was this the first car following the merger of Ron Dennis's Formula 2 team and McLaren, but the Marlboro Project 4-1 was the first car to race in Formula 1 built using a carbon fibre monocoque chassis instead of aluminium. Interestingly, the first car to use a carbon fibre chassis was the Lotus 88 that same year, but it was quickly banned before the season began due to its famous twin chassis design, so the MP4-1 holds this title instead. After talking with various British companies, McLaren eventually turned to Hercules Aerospace in Salt Lake City to supply McLaren with the carbon fibre necessary to build the car, whilst also hiring Steve Nichols, who had worked at Hercules since 1973. Plans for the car first started to be drawn up in 1979, and when it finally rolled out of the workshop in 1981, it was far more advanced than anything they had built before. John Watson would drive the car to its first victory at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, but it would be a largely successful season for McLaren, who were recovering from a poor couple of years, and since then they would grow into the dominant force that we all know today. The car's design concept was truly tested during one particular race, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, where John Watson put his McLaren 7th on the grid. With an incident-filled opening few laps of the race, which was common for this time, John Watson was running well and chased down Nelson Piquet in the Brabham on lap 19. But the rain started to fall in places, and the track became quite damp and greasy, which was causing issues for some drivers, particularly at the Parabolica corner. As Watson chased Piquet through the two Lesmo corners, a frightening scene unfolded as quick as a flash.
Out of the points at the moment is Carlos Reutemann. There he is, storming along in the back behind John Watson, who loses it. That's John Watson, and a very nasty one indeed. Torn the whole of the back off the car, and that's a very, very bad one indeed.
As Watson exited the second Lesmo corner, he veered slightly left, which put his McLaren onto the curbs, which resulted in the tyres slipping on the damp surface, sending the Northern Irishman spinning into the barriers on the right-hand side. The car exploded into hundreds of shattered pieces, with the engine and gearbox ripping away from the chassis, resulting in the fuel lines exploding, but luckily not the fuel tank itself, which was still attached to the front end. The car lay on the circuit in two pieces, and Michele Alboreto in the Tyrrell had to swerve to avoid the flying engine, resulting in his retirement from the race as well. Despite an extremely violent crash, John Watson just got up and walked away completely unharmed, single-handedly proving the hypothesis that carbon fibre monocoques were far safer and stronger than aluminium. Despite early skepticism, other teams began to design their own carbon fibre cars, and over the next couple of years, the rest of the paddock would copy this monocoque design. Sadly, in 1982, Gilles Villeneuve and Riccardo Pelletti would both be killed in an accident whereby their aluminium-designed cars were a significant factor in their deaths. As carbon fibre featured more prominently in F1, severe injury and death dramatically decreased, which is a testament to how strong and rigid carbon fibre is. After all, Hercules Aerospace actually kept Watson's ruined McLaren on display at their headquarters to demonstrate the benefits of carbon fibre uses to guests and potential customers for many years after. Despite some experiments using Kevlar, carbon fibre remains the go-to material for F1 car construction today, and it all started in 1981. In the 1987 season, the Williams pair of Nelson Piquet and Nigel Mansell was unquestionably the strongest driver lineup that season, with the ultra-powerful and technologically advanced FW11B. Nelson Piquet was world champion with Brabham in 1981 and 1983. He was also expected to be number one driver at Williams, and considered his lesser successful teammate to not be much of a threat. In comparison, Nigel Mansell had been with Williams since 1985 and had won his first Grand Prix at Brands Hatch that year. This pairing wasn't exactly a happy coexistence, however. Both drivers had a deep dislike for one another, and their short-tempered personalities made the situation even worse. Despite winning the Constructors' title in 1986, Piquet and Honda felt that Williams had cost Nelson the title by simply allowing Mansell to win races. In fact, at the British Grand Prix that same year, the crowd at Brands Hatch were entertained by a brilliant battle between the two drivers, with Nigel coming out victorious and Piquet in second. However, Piquet was incensed by this result and refused to even shake Nigel's hand on the podium. In 1987, the stakes were even higher, as Williams were the dominant force and the two drivers only had to worry about each other. They still had to be careful though. This was after all the late 1980s, and Grand Prix racing was still extremely dangerous, and anything can happen when you least expect it. During Friday practice for the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola, Nelson Piquet had a severe high-speed accident going through the notorious Tamburello corner. In similar circumstances to the Gerhard-Berger crash 2 years later, it is suspected that one of Piquet's tyres failed whilst he negotiated this flat-out corner, meaning Nelson could do nothing to prevent hitting the concrete wall. This accident would only be the start of this corner's bloody history, some of which can be explored in previous episodes of this series. Whilst Piquet himself claimed he only had a sore ankle and was fine to race, Sid Watkins had other opinions, and after further checks, Sid banned Nelson from starting the race. In secret, Nelson would suffer with frequent headaches and occasional double vision for the remainder of that season, something he only revealed much later. Nigel Mansell, meanwhile, took this opportunity to gain some lead ahead of Nelson in the championship and won the San Marino Grand Prix in his absence. Over the course of the season, both drivers would virtually be neck and neck in the championship, but Mansell would have more retirements than Piquet, including a controversial collision with the Lotus of Ayrton Senna at the Belgian Grand Prix, in which Mansell angrily confronted Senna in the Lotus garage and whereby a fistfight ensued. The penultimate race of the season was at Suzuka for the Japanese Grand Prix. Mansell had just won the last 2 races at Spain and Mexico, but Piquet was still 12 points ahead of the Brit and had the chance of winning the championship if Nigel failed to finish, and fans looked forward to an exciting battle that on paper looked set to continue right to the last race at Adelaide. This, however, never happened. The reason why occurred before the race had even started. Mansell was attempting to beat Piquet's time during Friday practice and was negotiating the exit of turn 1 when he suddenly lost control on the curbs, sending his Williams spinning into the barriers at high speed. Whilst the backwards impact into the barriers was a bad hit, Nigel suffered serious back injuries when the car returned to the ground extremely hard. Immediately, Mansell was in extreme pain and he was later diagnosed with spinal cord concussion. As drivers sit in a heavily reclined position in the cockpit, your lower back sits extremely close to the ground, and this would be the defining factor in causing Nigel's injuries. Due to these injuries, he was unable to start the race, and with his competition now out of contention, Nelson Piquet won his 3rd Drivers' Championship. On reflection, Nelson called his championship victory a win of intelligence over stupidity, referring to himself being far more consistent than Mansell, something which he described as percentage driving policy. This was to be the last championship victory for Nelson Piquet, as he would join the Honda-powered Lotus team for 1988, but his career slowly wavered until he retired in 1991. Despite a dire 2-year spell at Ferrari in 1989 and 1990, Nigel Mansell would secure the Drivers' and Constructors' title for Williams in 1992 and would also win the American Kart Championship in 1993. Nigel Mansell's exploits continue to be loved and admired in the United Kingdom right up until today. In episode 2, we spoke about the formation of Ligier and how the death of Joe Schlesser had an impact on the new car manufacturer and Formula 1 team. Sadly though, Ligier's involvement in Formula 1 stopped in 1997 when the team was purchased by Alain Prost, who had expressed interest in doing so as early as 1992. Following the purchase, Alain Prost rebranded the team into Prost Grand Prix, bringing an end to Ligier's F1 history, which had existed for 20 years. Although for its first year, Prost used the Ligier JS45 as it was already built for 1997 before the purchase was completed. Despite initially being a competitive midfield team, over the next 5 years Prost's results would sharply decline, and after many serious money issues, they folded shortly after the 2001 season had concluded, with Alain Prost later saying that this venture was probably the biggest mistake of his life, as it left him almost completely bankrupt. Prost did have some notable drivers over its short history though, including Olivier Panis, Jarno Trulli, Jean Alesi and Nick Heidfeld. Another driver who had driven for Prost in its final days was Luciano Burti from Brazil. Although competitive in British Formula 3, his F1 career didn't go down too well. In 2000, he became test driver for the new Jaguar team, mainly due to impressing Jacky Stewart the previous year whilst he was still in charge of the Stewart F1 team, before Ford purchased and rebranded the team into Jaguar. He made his race debut at the 2000 Austrian Grand Prix, where he was a last-minute replacement for the ill Eddie Irvine and achieved a fantastic 11th place finish on debut. His performances in testing earned Burti a full-time seat alongside Eddie Irvine. This wouldn't last, however. Amongst the team's low morale surrounding managerial problems and with the impatience of Ford breathing down the team's neck, Burti was sacked by Jaguar after only 4 races, despite having better results than Eddie Irvine already that season. Burti though quickly found a seat at Prost, replacing the sacked Gaston Mazzacane. His performances were more or less the same as they had been with Jaguar, despite driving a slightly less competitive car, and this included equalling a career best finish at Canada where he finished 8th. Fast forward a few weeks to the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim, Burti was involved in a frightening accident at the start of the race.
5 lights, you know what happens next. Go! Great start by Montoya, but Ralf Schumacher's away well as also alongside him into the first corner, and one of the Ferraris has been left behind. It's Rubens Barrichello.
It's
massive accident. Luciano Burti rolls it. Luciano Burti got tangled up in a huge roll. That's sure to bring out the red flag, Martin.
Michael Schumacher's Ferrari encountered gear selection problems when the lights went out, and thus was extremely slow off the start. Burti was eager to get ahead of the Jordan of Ricardo Zonta and moved right to pass him, but did not see the struggling Schumacher. Michael did notice Burti approach from behind, but stated he could not move out of the way in time due to his gear problems. Both drivers thankfully were unhurt and were able to make the restart after the race was red flagged after this incident in what was the final race at Hockenheim to use the wonderful forest section. Burti's fortunes would not improve however, and at the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, an accident involving 2 backmarkers once again brought the red flags out only 4 laps into the race.
The optimum, but as I said, so many of these teams do not have as much data, and somebody had a big one
there. I can't see who it is. Pile of tyres, and
there's a Jaguar and a Prost, so we think it's Burti and Eddie Irvine.
Yeah, it is Irvine.
And that Prost is a long way into those tyres. Where is
it? Here it is. There is Burti in the yellow helmet. This is a replay, of course, and they touch as Eddie Irvine goes past. Burti loses it, goes over the grass into the gravel trap in the Prost.
That is a nasty accident, Murray. I'm not looking forward to this thing connecting, because that is on the way into Blanchimont. That is 190 miles an hour. Ooh. And I wouldn't be surprised if they don't have to red flag this race. That is not a good, there's no good accidents. That is a bad incident there for Luciano Burti.
Luciano Burti chased down his former teammate Eddie Irvine and made a move to pass Irvine on the inside of Blanchimont, the flat-out left-handed kink preceding the bus stop chicane. Unfortunately, Irvine was caught completely off guard by this move and opted to remain on the racing line, which forced the Prost's left side onto the grass. Cutting in front of Burti, contact was made, causing his front wing to detach. This sudden loss of downforce caused the Prost to become completely uncontrollable through the 190 miles an hour kink, and the car continued straight on through the gravel trap and into the tyre barrier. Due to the car's speed, the gravel did very little to slow Burti down, resulting in Burti hitting the barrier at 150 miles per hour, with an impact force registered at 111 Gs. Burti's car was sent deep into the tyre barrier and was almost completely buried within. Worse still, Burti's head took most of the impact from the tyre wall, severely damaging his helmet. Marshals were quick to his aid, who worked quickly to dig Burti out of the tyre wall, and were joined soon after by Eddie Irvine and Professor Sid Watkins. Luckily though, Burti wasn't trapped for too long, and after being taken to the circuit's medical centre, he wasn't suffering with any serious injuries apart from a bad concussion, which kept him in hospital for a few days afterwards. His life was saved thanks to his headrest absorbing the impact, and that's despite his helmet being almost completely destroyed. The headrest was also credited with saving the life of Jos Verstappen, who had an awful crash at Spa in 1996. Helmet designs were also made stronger after this incident. Luciano Burti wouldn't race in F1 ever again, and would end his involvement in the sport at the end of the 2004 season after 2 years being test driver for Ferrari. Throughout the history of motorsport, there are a few accounts of people competing in both motorcycle racing and car racing. The most notable recent example is Valentino Rossi, who is considered one of the greatest motorcycle racers of all time with 9 world championships to his name. He began to compete in car racing after his retirement from MotoGP in 2021 and will be competing in the LMGT3 class in the World Endurance Championships in 2024 with WRT Racing. One of the more famous examples of this is John Surtees, who is the only person to win World Championships in Grand Prix motorcycle racing and Formula 1, winning 7 motorcycle championships between 1956 and 1960 and winning the 1964 Formula 1 World Championship driving for Ferrari. Another driver who is not often spoken about today is Mike the Bike, Mike Hailwood. Often regarded as one of the greatest motorcycle racers of all time due to his natural ability to successfully race with any bike he had with various engine sizes, totaling 76 Grand Prix victories in his motorcycle career. This included an unprecedented 14 victories at the Isle of Man TT, which is undeniably one of, if not the most dangerous race in the entire world, where 280 riders, marshals and spectators have died there since 1911. Just like we've already established, it wasn't long before Mike Hailwood began to compete in car racing, making his debut at the 1963 British Grand Prix in the Lotus 24 for Reg Parnell Racing. It wasn't until 1969 when his car racing career really began, as he went on to compete in European Formula 5000 and Formula 2 for the following 3 years, and in this time won the 1972 Formula 2 title, whilst also driving for Surtees in Formula 1. Unlike team owner John Surtees though, Mike's F1 career wouldn't be as successful as his motorcycle career. He joined McLaren in 1974 and was actually competitive, including a podium finish at Kyalami. His F1 career looked set to really get going from this point, but a serious crash at the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring put an early end to his F1 career. During the extremely steep downhill Flatzgarten section, a part of his suspension broke, leading to the car spearing violently to the right and into the barriers, trapping Mike in the car and severely breaking his legs. He would never return to Formula 1 again, but he would be remembered for another incident which occurred during the 1973 South African Grand Prix at Kyalami. On the third lap of the race, Mike Hailwood and the BRM of Clay Regazzoni collided, and the images of the aftermath show the sheer brutality of Formula 1 in the 1970s. After the collision, Regazzoni's BRM erupted into flames, with Clay trapped in the cockpit. In these moments, you have no time to think, but the adrenaline kicks in and you act fast. Mike Hailwood went to the burning BRM and attempted to pull Regazzoni out of the car. However, since he was trapped, it wasn't an easy task, and whilst Mike struggled to rescue Clay, his own race suit also began to catch fire. Mike had no choice but to abort his rescue attempt and run away to the other side of the track, where a large area of grass would see Mike drop and roll to extinguish himself. A marshal also came to his aid, whilst other marshals continued to struggle with Clay's burning car. After nearly 3 minutes of being trapped, Clay Regazzoni was pulled out and his life was saved by none other than Mike Hailwood himself. After the fire on his overalls were extinguished, he ran straight back into the field of danger, risked his own life, and this time managed to pull Regazzoni from the flames. This heroic act shattered the playboy exterior that was synonymous with him. In fact, after this incident, Mike returned to the pits, where his future wife Pauline was waiting for him, and Mike didn't even tell her what had happened. She only found out the following day after seeing a newspaper headline showing her husband's heroic actions. His actions did not go unnoticed, and he was awarded the George Medal. Issued in the UK and Commonwealth nations, this medal is awarded to civilians or non-military persons for acts of great bravery. The only other Formula 1 driver to also be given this honour was David Purley, whose story we explored in episode 2. Mike the Bike would return to motorcycle racing after stepping away from car racing, even winning the Isle of Man TT again in 1979 before retiring from racing altogether. Sadly though, Mike wouldn't be able to enjoy his retirement for too long. On Saturday, the 2nd of March 1981, Mike and his 2 young children, Michelle and David, were in a car travelling to a local fish and chip shop to collect dinner for the evening. On the return journey, a nearby lorry made an illegal turn and collided with Mike's car. Michelle, Mike's 9-year-old daughter, passed away on the scene. 2 days later, Mike Hailwood passed away due to severe internal injuries. David luckily survived the accident. Clay Regazzoni, whose life was saved, also would meet a tragic end. During the 1980 United States Grand Prix West at Long Beach, his ensign's brakes failed at the end of the long straight, crashing into another stationary car before hitting the concrete wall. Clay was left paralysed from the waist down. Despite his injuries, Clay continued to make occasional appearances in rally and sports car racing with specially modified cars right up until 1990. In December 2006, Clay was travelling along the A1 motorway in Italy when he crashed into the rear of a lorry, and tragically, the 67-year-old Clay Regazzoni did not survive. All they wanted to do was to enjoy their well-earned retirement, but fate had other plans. There are many more accounts of true heroism in the sport, including the drivers who rushed to help Niki Lauda in his fiery accident at the Nürburgring in 1976, the aforementioned Mike Hailwood and David Purley, and James Hunt, who pulled Ronnie Peterson out of his burning Lotus at Monza in 1978. Another incredible act of bravery occurred during qualifying at the 1992 Belgian Grand Prix. Erik Comas didn't have the most exciting Formula 1 career, with 59 starts over 4 years, and only achieving 7 points in total despite enjoying a fantastic junior career. In 1992, the Williams duo of Nigel Mansell and Riccardo Patrese were the dominant force, whilst Ligier was seeking to rebuild themselves after 2 years without scoring a single point. The JS37 was an improvement from previous designs, and Erik could finally begin to show his talent, and scored his first points at the Canadian Grand Prix, followed by more points finishes in France and Germany. Erik was in fantastic form and was eager to build on these good results with another in Hungary, but on the first corner of the first lap he collided with teammate Thierry Boutsen, despite having a brilliant getaway off the line. Spa-Francorchamps was next, and qualifying was underway. Despite not having the fastest car that year, Ayrton Senna, like always, was fighting for pole position as he negotiated the 4.3-mile circuit. He passed through the flat-out Blanchimont corner at nearly 190 miles an hour, and was first on scene to a horrifying sight. Erik Comas had lost control coming out of the Blanchimont corner and crashed into the tyre barriers at nearly 170 miles per hour. The impact was so hard, Erik was knocked unconscious instantly, and the Ligier was thrown back onto the circuit, spewing debris all over the track. Senna slowed down to a crawl, but despite the loud 3.5-litre Honda V12 that he had in his McLaren, the screaming Renault V10 in the Ligier could be heard for miles around. Why? As Erik sat unconscious in his car, his right foot was still pressed down on the throttle pedal as the engine screamed at its limits at 13,500 RPM. This could easily cause a catastrophic failure and risk an explosion as fuel continued to be pumped around the Ligier. Erik Comas was in serious danger, but Senna knew what to do. Competition aside, Senna parked up his McLaren, got out, and ran straight back down the track into oncoming cars to the stricken Ligier. Once he reached Erik, he instantly shut the engine down and held Erik's head in a stable position until medical crews arrived. To this day, Erik credits Senna for saving his life during an era where close calls were becoming more and more common until the events of the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix ended all luck. If you watched the live coverage of that race, you may remember another close call that happened minutes after Senna crashed at Tamburello. Whilst medical crews tended to Senna during the red flag, a single car left the pit lane and made its way through Tamburello close to full speed. The car came across the scene and instantly applied the brakes and stopped just in time to avoid hitting the panicked rescue teams.
John, this is ridiculous. I mean, how can that LaRousse get out of the pits when there's a red flag?
Well, I'm gobsmacked. I think that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen at any time in my life, that a Grand Prix car is allowed when the course is under a red, everybody is stopped on the pit lane.
The driver of that LaRousse was Erik Comas. Despite many believing that he went out to try and help Senna, he was actually sent out onto the track by mistake, as the relatively new team were not aware there was a red flag. As Erik was now on the scene, he helplessly witnessed medical teams trying in vain to save Senna's life. This had a profound effect on Erik, and he decided not to participate in the restart. For the rest of 1994, he managed to score one more point in his uncompetitive LaRousse, but would retire from F1 at the end of that same year. To this day, he has not spoken about what he saw on that terrible day at Imola. The United Kingdom currently holds the title for the most successful country in Formula 1, having 162 drivers enter Grand Prix under the British flag, with 10 of them winning 20 drivers' championships between them. There were many other fantastic British drivers who were unlucky to never win a championship, like David Coulthard and Stirling Moss. And there are many more who had never even managed a single win in Formula 1. One of those was Derek Warwick, who couldn't seem to find any luck during his F1 career. Making his debut with Toleman in 1981, he would go on to find a seat with Renault in 1984, who up until that point were a competitive team. But Renault would field a poor car for that year, and Warwick achieved 2 podiums that season, albeit the first in his career. 1985 was even worse, and Warwick could only achieve 3 points finishes, leading to Renault withdrawing from the sport completely at the end of that season. Despite spending the next 4 years driving uncompetitive cars for Brabham and Arrows, Derek would eventually find a seat with Lotus, something that Derek had been trying to achieve since Ayrton Senna left at the end of 1987. But by 1990, Lotus would be a shadow of their former selves, and it was clear to almost everyone that their future in F1 was hanging on by a thread. Despite Lotus team management being extremely over-optimistic before the start of the season, predicting that Derek and teammate Martin Donnelly would score 40 points in 1990, the reality, however, was that the Lotus 102 powered by a 3.5 litre Lamborghini V12 engine was a slow and unreliable mess, and Derek could only score 3 points after 11 races, with Martin not achieving any. After his F1 career ended, Derek would reflect on the 102, stating that it would flex all over the place, and that the Lamborghini V12 was all noise and no go. Despite this, both drivers would qualify reasonably well at Monza for the Italian Grand Prix, with Martin Donnelly starting in P11 and Warwick directly behind in P12. On the opening lap, Derek would have a better start and was ahead of his teammate as they approached the famous parabolic corner before completing the lap. Derek, however, never completed the first lap.
To get away well and at least split the McLarens, and he was very tardy off the grid.
Elise's drive, as I said, is almost unbelievable. Oh God! That is a Lola. That's all I can tell. No, it's Derek Warwick. It's Derek Warwick who's crashed.
Despite the sheer violence of the accident, Derek was able to get himself out of the car, calmly walk away from his overturned Lotus, and was thankfully unhurt.
And as you can smile.
my goodness, he's okay. That is an incredible testimony to the strength and safety of the construction of the cars these days, and there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the race will have to be stopped because the car is on the exit.
As the Lotus exited the corner, he went slightly wide whilst following the latent house of Mauricio Gugelmin ahead of him and went onto the grass. By this point, the Lotus would have been travelling in excess of 120 miles per hour, and Derek was nothing but a passenger as he slammed into the barriers, flipping upside down in the process. Worse still, his Lotus continued down the track and was in danger of being hit by another car at high speed, which thankfully didn't happen. Any normal person would perhaps be put off driving for a while after an accident like this, but that's not how a driver's mindset works. With the race red flags after this accident and Derek unhurt, he then proceeded to run down the pit lane back to the Lotus garage. Back in the 1990s, teams were allowed spare cars, which enabled drivers to re-enter a race if their first car had been too badly damaged before a red flag situation. This is exactly what Derek was doing. Lotus quickly prepared the spare 102 and Derek was able to make the restart, once again starting from P12, completely unfazed by what had just happened minutes ago. This was not the first time he had experienced a severe accident in F1 though, and in 1988 he had an airborne crash during qualifying at the Canadian Grand Prix. He impacted what is now known as the Wall of Champions so hard that it briefly knocked him unconscious and seriously hurt his back in a similar manner to what Nigel Mansell experienced in 1987. Due to this experience, Nigel provided on-scene assistance to the medical staff attending to Derek. Thankfully, Derek didn't suffer any serious injuries and took part in the race on Sunday. In his final year in F1 whilst driving for Footwork in 1993, he had another severe accident, this time during the warm-up for the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim. In the wet conditions, he collided with the Lola of Luca Badauer, losing the entire right-hand side of the car. His car drove uncontrollably into the gravel trap at high speed before flipping upside down, trapping Derek in the car. But luckily he was unhurt and was able to get out of the car once it was righted. Derek would retire from F1 after 1993, left to reflect back on his career with a huge what if. However, his 1990 Lotus teammate Martin Donnelly's career very nearly cost him his life, but we'll look more into that very soon. Formula 1 has a long tradition of beginning Grand Prix races with a standing start, as opposed to the more commonly used rolling start. Whilst this method certainly creates more tension before the start of the race, there are also many dangers and crashes from the start line isn't a rare sight. A good example of this occurring was at the 1995 Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril. But to properly tell the story about what happened here, I'll leave you with none other than Peter Brook.
Ukyo Katayama was one of the first full-time Japanese Formula 1 drivers, following in the footsteps of Satoru Nakajima in 1987 and Aguri Suzuki in 1988. After winning the Japanese Formula 3000 title in 1991, he got a seat with Venturi for the following year. It was a less than successful year, but led to him signing with Tyrrell for 1993, who had just taken on Yamaha engines. 1993 was fruitless, but he scored 5 points amidst numerous retirements in 1994. He went into his third season with them in 1995 and struggled further here as the previous year he'd been diagnosed with a benign tumour in his back, which prevented him accepting a seat with an undisclosed front-running team, and the raised cockpit sides limited his visibility. By the 13th round at Estoril, he'd seen the checkered flag only 3 times with a best finish of 7th, and teammate Mika Salo had just scored the team's first points of the year at Monza. At Estoril, Katayama qualified 16th, just behind Salo. At the start, he was passed by the Minardi of Pedro Lamy in 17th, and then moved across to the left where he locked wheels with Lamy's teammate Luca Badauer, who was coming up alongside him.
Second place by the looks of things. Tyrrell has turned upside down and is spinning across the track. 2 cars have come into contact. Problems also in the first corner, and there you see the result of what happens frequently here in Portugal, and that is the remains. We're not sure Ukyo Katayama, we think,
And there one of those, Moreno's car also trapped, red flag, very quickly out. And this is an unfortunate and a very unpleasant incident.
This launched Katayama into the air while Badoer speared off to the right into the pit wall. Katayama rolled several times and hit the barriers on the opposite side, and he and Badoer both then spun back onto the track, and Katayama hit the rear of the Pacific of Andrea Montemini and blocked in the 40 of Roberto Moreno and came to a rest upside down, with all four wheels, the engine cover, the nose cone and the front and rear wings all torn off, but the roll hoop and carbon fibre chassis stood firm. The race was immediately red flagged, becoming the fourth red flagged race that year. Katayama was quickly extricated from the car and the race restarted 25 minutes later. He spent the next 2 days in hospital but had little more than a strained neck and some bruising. He was advised to miss the European Grand Prix, where his seat was taken by Tyrrell's test driver Gabriele Tarquini, but he returned for the Pacific Grand Prix in Japan.
Spa-Francorchamps is often regarded as the world's best racing circuit. Located in the Ardennes region of Belgium, the circuit originally was 9 miles long, held on public roads, which featured some of the most feared corners in all of motorsport, including Bournonville, Malmedy, Master and Stavelot, just to name a few. This configuration for a long time was one of the fastest circuits in the world, but with that came serious danger, and many severe accidents took place on the old Spa circuit. Before 1970, there were virtually no safety features protecting drivers and spectators alike, except for a few straw bales dotted around the circuit. Trees, lampposts, houses, parked cars, fences, fields and people awaited any driver who made even the smallest of mistakes. Combine this with the unpredictable Ardennes weather, creates a recipe for total catastrophe, and we will be shortly looking at one infamous example from this old circuit. After F1 and the World Sports Car Championship shunned Spa in 1971 and 1975 respectively, racing stopped on the old circuit in 1978, and work began to rebuild the circuit into what it is today. In 1979, the new and modern 4.3 mile Spa was opened and was immediately popular with fans and drivers, as it still retained its high-speed notoriety. Since then, however, 2 corners in particular have risen to become the most famous pieces of tarmac in the entire world. Air Rouge and Raidillon were previously slow corners that didn't provide much trouble for drivers, as the most feared corners at the time were Master or Malmedy. Since 1979, the uphill blind sequence has been slowly straightened and widened to allow much faster speeds than it has ever seen before. In fact, the most modern racing cars can take on this sequence flat out. In recent times, the safety of this sequence has been called into question, as this corner is a location for some extremely bad accidents that occur almost every year. In 2023, the number 3 Cadillac being driven by Renger van der Zande crashed at Air Rouge in wet conditions during the WEC 6 Hours of Spa. During the Spa round of the 2021 former all-female W Series, rain began to fall during qualifying, and there was a multiple car pile-up at the top of Raidillon as the grip levels fell away extremely quickly. In 1999, the BAR drivers of Jacques Villeneuve and Ricardo Zonta both crashed at this corner after both drivers made a bet to see if they could take this sequence flat out, and, well, you can see the results. And tragically, in 2019, 22-year-old Formula 2 driver Antoine Hubert was killed in an accident on the exit of Raidillon. These are just a handful of continuous list of accidents that have taken place at this same spot. Another accident that took place in 1993 involved none other than a young Alex Zanardi. This was Zanardi's first season in Formula 1 after making 3 appearances for Jordan in 1991 and replacing the injured Christian Fittipaldi from Minardi for another 3 races in 1992. As we already established earlier, Lotus were no longer the team that they had been, but Alex joined them on a full-time basis for 1993 and left as Benetton test driver in the process. The Lotus 107, complete with its active suspension, was a vast improvement to its predecessors. Johnny Herbert would praise the design, stating that the 107 was sublime to drive and responsive to setup changes, but lacked overall reliability. The team's focus to developing their own active suspension design meant that much of the rest of the car was untouched from 1992. Nevertheless, Herbert and Zanardi would secure a handful of points finishes before the Belgian Grand Prix. After 4 retirements in the last 4 races, Ickx was eager to turn his fortunes around. During Friday practice, he approached the narrow but fast Air Rouge and Raidillon sequence. As he did so, the rear of his Lotus stepped out from him, and his season would be over in just a couple of seconds. As the rear of the Lotus began to slip away whilst climbing the dangerous hill, Ickx would countersteer to regain control just like any other driver would do. But on this formidable section, this action led to Ickx losing complete control of the car, and he crashed headfirst into the barriers at approximately 170 miles per hour. His car was ripped apart from the impact, and debris was thrown all across Raidillon. Michael Andretti in the McLaren following closely behind had to slow down sharply to avoid hitting any debris. But this sudden deceleration caught teammate Ayrton Senna off guard, who was travelling to the scene at full speed. By sheer miracle, Ickx was only momentarily unconscious and sustained only relatively minor back and leg injuries. He was forced to miss the rest of the season due to concussion and would eventually return at the 1994 Spanish Grand Prix. Alex Zanardi today is well known for escaping death on numerous occasions, most notably a near-fatal accident in the 2001 American Memorial Kart race, which resulted in Zanardi losing both of his legs. But do you think losing his legs would stop Ickx? Absolutely not. And in future documentaries, we shall look further into the inspirational career of Alessandro Zanardi. As we already mentioned, the old public road circuit of Spa-Francorchamps was one of the most feared in motorsport history. Despite F1 and WSC leaving Spa, deaths and horrific crashes continued in touring car racing, in particular the Spa 24 Hours. On one occasion, at around 5 AM of the 1972 24 Hours of Spa, Hans Struck came in for a pit stop and was also expecting Jochen Mass to take over the drive for a few hours. Just before he left, Hans shouted to Jochen to watch out for body parts at the Master kink. Mass arrived at Master shortly after and expected to see pieces of car debris across the road. As it turned out, Hans Struck was actually referring to a trackside marshal named Leon Grizzard, who was hit by Walter Brunn in his Mazda. In 1960, 2 drivers died within minutes of each other at almost the same spot during the Belgian Grand Prix, and in 1939, the popular British driver Richard Seaman would be involved in a fiery accident on the approach to the La Source hairpin whilst driving for Mercedes during a very wet Belgian Grand Prix, and he passed away due to his injuries he sustained that day. Drivers hated it. They feared for their lives, and some would even simply not turn up for a race due to the concerns they had. Jim Clark would also go on record to voice how much he hated the circuit, despite Spa being his most successful circuit in Formula 1. In 1966, the 3-litre engine regulations were in full force, which meant the cars were significantly faster than they had ever been, and this put drivers in greater risk of injury or even death. It was only the second race of the season, so this was the first time these new cars would properly be able to go at full speed. In the early afternoon of the 12th of June 1966, 16 cars lined up to begin 28 laps of Spa. Among them was 1961 world champion Phil Hill, who was driving a camera car to shoot real scenes for the upcoming John Frankenheimer movie Grand Prix. Neither he or the other 15 runners were prepared for the absolute disaster that was about to take place. The race got underway and the first handful of corners went by calmly as the cars passed through Radion, the Kemmel curves and Les Combes. But as they approached the fearsome sweeping right-hander of Bournonville, they encountered an unexpected torrential rainstorm catching everyone off guard. 4 drivers crashed at this corner almost simultaneously. Joe Bonnier was one of these drivers, and his Cooper T81 came to a rest balancing on top of a parapet, dangerously close to falling several feet below. As the field passed through the master kink, 4 more drivers would fall victim to the flooded track: Bob Bondurant, Graham Hill, Jack Brabham and Jacky Stewart. Brabham was able to recover from his 130 mph spin and rejoin the race. There was so much water that it flooded the Coventry engine on Jim Clark's Lotus, putting him out of the race as well. By the end of the first lap, only 7 cars were left. Phil Hill, driving the camera car, managed to escape all of this and record the remarkable scenes that were shown in the film before withdrawing after the first lap. At Master though, the situation was worse. Jacky Stewart was one of the 4 drivers who had crashed here as he spun off at the entrance to the kink at approximately 160 mph. His BRM continued off to the right hand side and slammed sideways into a telegraph pole before being ricocheted into a ditch and finally coming to a rest upside down in a farmer's outbuilding. The damage was severe and Jacky's pelvis was twisted in a mangled wreck, with the damaged steering column also trapping his legs. The fuel tanks were also damaged, leading to the fuel slowly being released into the cockpit. It was a ticking time bomb. With no chance of escape and soaked to the skin in fuel, there was no marshals in that area that could come and help. Graham Hill, Bob Bondurant and a local farmer found Jacky in serious danger and worked quickly to save his life. They had to be extremely careful though, as any small spark or hot components could cause the fuel to ignite. Using a toolkit given by a spectator, it took them 25 minutes before Jacky was safely extracted from the wreck, but his ordeal wasn't over just yet. Since there were no doctors or medical facilities nearby, Jacky was placed into the bed of a pickup truck as they waited for an ambulance. Eventually one would arrive and took Jacky to the circuit's first aid centre. To his shock, he realised that this first aid centre was more or less a rundown shed, and once he was placed onto the floor on a stretcher, he looked around to see cigarette ends and other rubbish spewing about all over the floor. Finally, another ambulance came to take Jacky to a hospital in Liège, but got lost on the way. This led to Jacky being flown back to the UK via private jet for proper treatment. This was the incident which permanently changed the way Stewart viewed motorsport safety, and from here on out he would begin a huge campaign to improve safety. Initially opposed by many drivers, he teamed up with BRM team boss Louis Stanley to advocate for better medical facilities and crash barriers around every circuit, especially barriers separating the pit lane and the fast lane, which were completely non-existent during this time. He organised driver boycotts, most notably at Spa in 1969, the Nürburgring in 1970 and Zandvoort in 1972. All of these circuits would subsequently go through extensive redevelopments. Mandatory seatbelts and full-face helmets was also an issue that Stewart pressed. These are just a handful of what Jacky was working to introduce and improve. Whilst it wasn't an instant fix to the problem, over the years his efforts began to shine through, with more and more drivers joining his side to assist in his efforts, including his best friend at the time, Jochen Rindt. Many modern day safety arrangements can be attributed to Jacky Stewart's efforts all those years ago, and we should always be grateful for that. Thank you, Jacky. Recently, Formula 1 announced that from 2026, the Spanish Grand Prix would be held within the grounds of an exhibition centre in Madrid, which was viewed with a mostly negative response from fans across the world. This venue would be the 6th circuit to host the Formula 1 Spanish Grand Prix. The first was a street circuit located in the Pedralbes area of Barcelona in 1951 and 1954. After that, it wasn't until 1968 when a championship Grand Prix event took place in Spain at the purpose-built Jarama circuit just north of Madrid. The Spanish Grand Prix would then alternate between Jarama and the Montjuic street circuit in Barcelona. After 1975, however, the Grand Prix would be held exclusively at Jarama after numerous safety issues and incidents that had occurred at Montjuic. This would last until 1981, when it was decided that Jarama was too small to host such a race, and the Spanish Grand Prix wouldn't return until 1986, this time taking place at the new Jerez circuit in the south of Spain. But its remote location proved troublesome to teams and spectators, and thus the Spanish Grand Prix was moved again in 1991 to the new Barcelona-Catalunya circuit, which we are all familiar with today. Jerez has also hosted 2 European Grand Prix in 1994 and the dramatic season finale in 1997. All these circuits had their issues though. Some were considerably dangerous, whilst others were simply unsuitable for F1, where overtaking was either difficult or impossible. Jarama was one of those circuits where overtaking was extremely difficult, and in 1970, before the race had even begun, the organisers had limited the number of starters to 16 cars out of the 22 that had entered, and announced that lap time set during Friday's sessions didn't count towards qualifying, sparking anger amongst the FOCA members. After much deliberation, the decision was final, and only 16 cars started the race, despite some drivers such as Rolf Stommelen setting lap times good enough for a P12 start, but were still wheeled off the grid and forced to go home. Still though, the race must go on, and Jack Brabham led away from pole for the 90-lap race. But before the end of the first lap, 2 cars collided, and a horrific scene unfolded. Jackie Oliver lost control of his BRM on the descent down to the turn 10 hairpin. He went onto the grass sideways and slid straight towards the apex of the corner. Passing through the hairpin was the Ferrari of Jacky Ickx. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and was completely unaware of the out of control Oliver that was approaching his left side. The collision sent both cars into the barriers. It didn't seem to be a hard impact initially, but the fuel from both cars suddenly erupted, engulfing Ickx and Oliver in a fierce firestorm. Jacky Oliver was able to escape quickly and run to safety, but Ickx struggled with the complex seatbelt buckle on his Ferrari. He was stuck in the fire for 20 seconds before finally managing to jump out and run to a nearby grassy area. Jacky Ickx was also soaked in fuel, and his race suit had caught fire during the time he spent sat in the car. Luckily, marshals were on hand to help Ickx, and the fire on his overalls was quickly put out, but Ickx had suffered burns to his skin and was quickly transferred to a nearby hospital for treatment. The fire continued to rage on the circuit however, and during this entire time, the race was not stopped, with drivers simply having to tiptoe around the blaze, whilst also trying to avoid the firefighting foam being thrown onto the fire from the grassy area, directly through the path that the cars passed through. In some cases, drivers got a face full of the foam, and others spun as the tarmac was covered in a mixture of foam and unburnt fuel. Once again, even as the destroyed and still burning Ferrari began to roll down the hill and into the path of oncoming drivers, the race was not stopped once. Both cars were completely destroyed, but luckily no other car was involved in the accident. Jacky Ickx was hospitalised for burns, but would recover in enough time to enter the next race at Monaco. According to him, this was his scariest incident in his F1 career, and reflected on this day by saying he was absolutely terrified.
With Alain Prost seemingly going to win it, and Mansell going round the outside. Incredible! Up into second place. He's regained that second place, and now he's fairly rocketing away from Berger on the last lap in Mexico.
The Mexican Grand Prix has had a long but often overlooked history in Formula 1. For one, it holds the somewhat rare title of being held at the same circuit for the entirety of its existence. The circuit was opened in 1959 to a fairly similar track design to what we know today. Located within the Magdalena Mixhuca Public Park in Mexico City, whereby the circuit was named after. As Mexico's first international circuit, it wouldn't be long until the very first Grand Prix event took place here, and in 1962 it became a reality when a non-championship event would take place on the 4th of November. But it was also this race where the circuit's fearsome reputation would begin. The circuit's high altitude proved troublesome for the cars, as there was not sufficient air getting to the engines to operate efficiently, with cooling also being a problem. The unstable soil underneath the tarmac also caused the track to become extremely bumpy over the time. But on the 1st of November 1962, unofficial practice was underway for this new Grand Prix event. On the circuit, driving a Rob Walker Lotus 24 was Mexico's very own Ricardo Rodriguez. As Mexico's first F1 driver, he was simply a superstar upon his arrival, and he certainly had the talent to match. Up until recently, he was the youngest F1 driver to drive for Ferrari after his debut at the infamous 1961 Italian Grand Prix. At Belgium in 1962, he became the youngest driver to score points in F1, a record not beaten until 2000. Until 2016, he was also the youngest driver to start from the front row of the grid. And finally, Ricardo remains the youngest driver to ever die in a Formula 1 race event. During this unofficial practice session, his Lotus would suddenly have a rear right suspension failure whilst he attacked the fearsome and ultra-fast Peraltada corner, the final corner before the main straight. This failure sent Ricardo into the barriers, and the impact launched him from the car, where he landed on nearby tarmac, killing the young Ricardo Rodriguez instantly. Mexico's young prodigy was now gone, starting a period of national mourning across the country. In attendance that day was Pedro Rodriguez, Ricardo's older brother. Still being very new to racing at this time, Pedro considered retiring from the sport after witnessing the death of his brother, but ultimately decided to carry on and became a brilliant Formula 1 and sports car driver himself, noted for being incredibly quick in wet conditions. In 1971, Pedro was also killed in an accident at a Norris Ring in Nuremberg, Germany, during an Interserie race. The Magdalena circuit was renamed the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez in honor of the two brothers, and the circuit today continues to hold this name. Upon Pedro's death, the Mexican Grand Prix was no longer on the Formula 1 calendar. The previous year saw extensive crowd trouble after a whopping 200,000 people showed up to watch the race, many of them deciding to climb over barriers and watch on directly from trackside. The race start was delayed by well over an hour as organisers fought to control the crowd and remove bottles and other rubbish that had found its way onto the track. Jacky Stewart even hit a stray dog that had ventured onto the track during the race, and many spectators were spotted crossing the tarmac on multiple occasions. It wouldn't be until 1986 when the Mexican Grand Prix returned at the redeveloped Hermanos Rodriguez circuit. The upgraded track meant that speeds on the fearsome Peraltada corner were much faster than they had ever been before, and this caused significant problems to drivers in the event of a crash. Derek Warwick experienced a nasty accident in 1987 when his rear suspension failed on the exit of this corner and sent him into the tyre barriers hard. In 1991, Ayrton Senna had also had a bad accident on this corner after losing the rear of the car midway through the turn, impacting the tyre barrier backwards and flipping the McLaren upside down. Senna though was unhurt and was able to escape his overturned McLaren, but the most dramatic incident occurred during qualifying in 1988. The 34-year-old Philippe Alliot was in his 5th year in Formula 1 and in his 2nd year with the LaRousse team using the Lola LC88. His career wouldn't be considered a success however, and he had only secured 4 points finishes in his career so far. He would also gain a reputation for bad accidents, including a dramatic airborne accident at Brands Hatch in 1984. But Mexico would be his worst, and as he came around the Peraltada corner at nearly 150 miles per hour, Alliot wouldn't have expected how badly this was to end up. As Philippe recalled, his Lola's rear began to feel loose as it righted the outside of the curb on the exit of Peraltada. He corrected the anticipated slide, but the car turned sharply to the right and headed straight for the pit wall where Ferrari and Lotus team members were sat directly behind. The car was completely destroyed and disintegrated as it rolled down the track before eventually resting upside down, nothing more than a shell. The impact was so hard that people in the pit lane who didn't see the accident later said that they could feel the ground shake as if a bomb had gone off. In a testament to the strong design of the Lola, Philippe was completely unharmed as he sat in a survival cell and quite simply brushed himself off and calmly walked away. Even more amazingly, the Larousse mechanics were able to rebuild this car overnight and start the race the next day. You can say all you want about the smaller teams, but their hearts were certainly in the right place, even if it meant that Alliot would retire on the first lap after suspension problems. Hermanos Rodriguez was dropped from the calendar after 1992 due to safety concerns, mainly with the surface issue on the bumpy track. It wouldn't return until 2015, and in that time the circuit had undergone significant renovations at the hands of Hermann Tilke. Most significant of these was the disappearance of the Peraltada corner and the Grand Prix configuration being routed through a new baseball stadium before coming back onto the old Peraltada at its midway point, whilst also being renamed the Nigel Mansell corner. Formula E, however, continued to use the entire corner, and that's even after a brief journey through the baseball stadium. But what do you think? Should F1 return to using the entire Peraltada corner or stay how it is? "1982 was a particularly horrific year in Formula 1. Already in this series, we've looked at previous accidents from this year, including René Arnoux at Zandvoort, Jochen Mass at Paul Ricard, Gilles Villeneuve at Zolder, and Riccardo Paletti in Canada. But the horrors wouldn't stop there, and a terrifying accident would take place once again at the notorious Hockenheimring in August. Unlike today, Hockenheim for most of its existence was 6.8 kilometers long, with much of the circuit running through an isolated and dense forest on a flat-out half-loop separated by 3 chicanes before entering the stadium section, which continues to exist today. Whilst popular with fans and drivers, this incredibly unique configuration did have its problems. Its remote location meant that drivers who retired in this section would have to wait a very long time before getting picked up to be taken back to the pits, and before safety standards improved, it could also be a very long time before anyone could come and find you if you had an accident. And before you had barriers, you had trees, and that's exactly what killed Jim Clark in April 1968. Weather was also a problem. As displayed at the dramatic 2000 German Grand Prix, it would be heavy rain in one part of the track, but perfectly dry in the other. This race also saw a dismissed Mercedes employee staging a one-man protest against the company by invading the track, highlighting the vulnerable security measures in the forest. In 1982, the Hockenheimring nearly claimed the life of another driver. It was torrential rain throughout the morning so far, and the track was almost flooded in some parts. Didier Pironi had set the fastest time in practice the previous day and in the dry. By now, he was the championship leader and looked set to win it. I'm sure by this point, all Didier wanted to do was win that championship and move on as quickly as he could. So far this season, he had to watch his friend and teammate Gilles Villeneuve die in an accident at Zolder trying to beat his own time in qualifying. At Canada, he stalled his Ferrari on the start line and the young Riccardo Paletti crashed into the back of his car at 110 miles per hour, killing him instantly. Most drivers opted to wait until the weather calmed down before venturing out on their qualifying runs, but some, including Pironi and the Renault of Alain Prost, decided to give the conditions a try. Alain was extremely cautious and was very careful not to go too fast, as visibility was almost at zero since the spray thrown from the back of passing cars hung in the air like a thick fog thanks to the large trees either side of the track. Didier Pironi, however, wasn't hanging around, and he continued to push his Ferrari as hard as he possibly could. Other drivers sat in the pit lane could hardly believe what they were seeing. As he entered the forest section once again on a flying lap, he encountered the slow-moving Williams of Derek Daly. He moved to the side to presumably allow Didier by, and he accelerated on at nearly 160 miles an hour. But what he could not see just up ahead was the slow-moving Renault of Alain Prost. The Ferrari hit the rear of the Renault, sending Didier Pironi up and into the air, in an accident scarily similar to what claimed the life of Gilles Villeneuve just a few months before. Didier Pironi also flipped in the air, but several feet higher than Gilles experienced. So high in fact, Didier later recalled seeing the top of the extremely tall trees, and witnesses would also go on to claim that this car did in fact go that high. Alain Prost looked up and saw a somersaulting Ferrari flying above him. It was 30 meters in the air, he said. The Ferrari would land on its rear before flipping over once again onto its nose, completely destroying the front end of the car in an extremely similar way to that of Gilles Villeneuve. As it rested, Didier was found still in his seat, but nothing else left in front of him. He was in extreme pain that only got worse, and from the photos you are seeing on screen, you can easily see the emotions on his face are those of a man who is in genuine fear of losing his life. Other drivers rushed over to help. Nelson Piquet was one of them. Didier asked him how his legs were, and as Nelson looked down, he turned away and vomited. Both legs were severely broken, with 2 bones sticking out from one of them. His left arm was also broken. Sid Watkins and his medical team gave serious thought to the possibility of amputation, as his legs were so badly mutilated. In pain, Didier pleaded as hard as he possibly could for his legs not to be removed, and luckily they were able to extract him from the wreck. It turned out later that Sid Watkins never considered amputation, and all that was made up in a panicked Didier's head. Many weeks of painful hospital treatment was to follow, and eventually Didier began to recover from this awful accident. It wouldn't be until 1986 when he drove a Formula 1 car again, when he tested both an AGS and Ligier JS27. Whilst he was still putting in competitive lap times, another F1 career simply was not practical due to the injuries he had, and that was that for Didier Pironi's F1 career. He still had a desire to race though, and found that offshore powerboat racing gave him that same satisfaction. On the 23rd of August 1987, Pironi was competing in a race off the coast of the Isle of Wight and was running second place as he approached an area where he had to turn the boat. At almost 100 miles an hour, Colibri, as the boat was named, hit a wake caused by a nearby oil tanker, flipping the boat over. The impact hardly caused any damage to Colibri, but hitting water at that speed would have been like hitting a brick wall. Didier Pironi, along with his 2 crew members, Bernard Giroux and Jean-Claude Guignard, were killed instantly. A tragic end to a career which deserved so much more, yet became surrounded by controversy, anger, and death. Earlier in this video, we spoke about the career of Derek Warwick and the accident he suffered during the 1990 Italian Grand Prix in what was a difficult period for the Lotus team. Derek's teammate that year was Martin Donnelly from Belfast, Northern Ireland. Martin was previously a test driver for Lotus, but had enjoyed a successful junior career driving for Eddie Jordan in British Formula 3 and International Formula 3000, finishing 3rd in the latter despite only competing in the final 5 races that season. He would continue to drive for Eddie Jordan into 1989, but partway through that season he was called by Arrows to substitute Derek Warwick, who had injured his back in a karting accident. So, at the 1989 French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard, he placed his temporary Arrows 14th on the grid, which was extremely impressive for the 25-year-old debutant. Even more impressive was the fact he managed to finish in 12th, albeit 3 laps down. Of course, Lotus very much enjoyed this performance, and after Nelson Piquet and Satoru Nakajima left the team at season's end, Lotus brought in Derek Warwick from Arrows and promoted Martin Donnelly to a full-time race seat. Someone who was happy to finally see him in F1 was his good friend Ayrton Senna, as the two came to get to know each other during their F3 days and would often have breakfast together. A bacon sandwich and a cup of tea was Senna's go-to morning meal, according to Martin. This friendship would not help Martin's fortunes with Lotus, however. As we previously discussed, Lotus were in a period of struggle, particularly with their unreliable Lamborghini engines. His first full-time start in F1 was at Phoenix for the United States Grand Prix, but wouldn't even make the start due to a gearbox failure. At Interlagos, he managed to start the race from P14, but after 43 laps, he spun off due to a front damper failure. An 8th place finish at Imola were followed by consecutive retirements at Monaco and Canada, once again a result of engine and gearbox issues. These kind of results would continue to plague Lotus all year, as poor reliability followed every good result they had, which proved that the Lotus 102 was a good midfield car, but was let down by Lamborghini. But Martin's impressive performances were getting attention from bigger teams, who began to look at him as a potential driver for the future. Who were those teams? We do not know. But Lotus was so alarmed that they promptly offered Martin a new and improved contract that would keep him at Lotus for the foreseeable future. He signed this contract just before the Spanish Grand Prix at Jerez. The 4.2km track was popular with drivers as it offered both high speed and slow speed racing through 16 corners. The most dangerous section though was the high speed flat out sequence from turn 13 to the final hairpin at turn 16, which passed through 2 right-handed corners. On Friday the 28th of September, as the grid were out on their practice runs, the circuit suddenly began to fall silent. Looking across from the back of the pit garages to turn 14, all that could be seen was a cloud of yellow dust. As this dust began to settle, this haunting image would begin to reveal itself. The man you see lying motionless on the track is Martin Donnelly. Just like what had happened in Interlagos, one of his front dampers failed as he negotiated the flat-out turn 14, sending him into the barriers at nearly 170 miles per hour. Upon impact, the Lotus 102 was split into two, with Donnelly being violently ejected while still being strapped to his seat. When he came to rest, his legs were twisted severely and he was completely still. Other drivers stopped to assist the marshals who came to aid Donnelly, followed shortly by Professor Sid Watkins. Ayrton Senna was also concerned for the health of his friend and ventured down to the crash site to see him. Many people believed that Martin was dead, and Senna was visibly upset by what he had seen. Donnelly was taken away to hospital by helicopter, and by sheer miracle, news started to come through that he was alive, although in critical condition. He suffered from multiple broken bones in his legs and bruising to both his lungs and brain. When Senna came to see Donnelly in Seville Hospital, he told his close friend Mark Gallagher that if he needed help with flights or any kind of financial help, just let me know and I'll organise it. Sid Watkins knew that Donnelly's survival chances lay purely on time, and also understood that Martin's organs would likely go into shock and begin to malfunction. With this serious situation looming, Martin was flown from Spain to the Royal London Hospital on the Tuesday after the race. As predicted, the following day his organs began to shut down, and he was put into a medically induced coma to try and save his life. Twice his heart stopped and had to be restarted by a defibrillator. Just like Niki Lauda in 1976, he was also given the last rites by a priest. But, thanks to the efforts by Sid Watkins and other doctors under his supervision, Martin Donnelly would slowly begin to recover, and finally woke from his coma after 7 weeks, later recalling that Sid saved his life 3 times. As it turned out, he swallowed his tongue upon impact. Over the next couple of years, Martin was forced to learn to walk again and find mobility in his left leg. Eager to return to racing, he turned to Willie Dungle, who had previously helped Niki Lauda get back to racing after his accident in 1976. But Donnelly didn't understand how bad his leg truly was, and he would undergo a number of surgeries and treatments so that by 1994 he was only just beginning to fully walk again, and that's despite a brief test with Jordan the previous year. But he started to have doubts about his future racing career, and took advice from his surgeon to forget about it and enjoy the rest of his life. Combine this with the death of his friend Ayrton Senna at Imola led to Martin Donnelly officially retiring from F1 for good. But his Lotus partnership would not end there in Jerez, as he had continued to work on a number of projects with the company over the years, including the development of a number of their road cars. His F1 involvement wasn't over either, as he was appointed FIA driver steward on several occasions. And during the Goodwood Festival of Speed in 2011, Martin drove a Formula 1 car again for the first time since 1993. Not just any car though, it was the Lotus 102. Whilst it wasn't the original that he drove, this one was to the same spec that he had all those years ago. Sometimes there are sights like this that happen in motorsport, where you can't help but watch on and smile. Looking at any modern F1 car, you cannot help but marvel at the aerodynamic designs that we see on these cars. From the front wing to the rear, the entire car is designed around aerodynamic efficiency. This critical component of an F1 car has extensively evolved over the decades to overly complex designs, a far cry from the 1950s where aerodynamics wasn't even considered when designing a car, with most constructors favouring the tried and tested reverse raindrop design. Although Mercedes entered their W196 with streamlined bodywork on a number of occasions. And in sports car racing, a Porsche 550 was entered into the 1956 1,000 km of Nürburgring, which featured a huge aerofoil above the driving position, but was forced to remove it by scrutineers. All this would change in the 1960s when Chaparral began experimenting with aero devices on their cars for their World Sports Car and Can-Am Championship efforts. Their first efforts, the Chaparral 2 and 2A, became very competitive in sports car racing, but the car's front end was generating lift, which made steering difficult at high speeds. Co-founder Jim Hall was an engineer and a keen innovator, eager to try and make anything he thought about work on his cars. In comes the 2C, which featured an integrated rear spoiler and small winglets at the front. Not only did this drastically improve their aerodynamic problems, but the rear wing could be opened and closed from within the car. The Chaparral's semi-automatic transmission meant that a clutch pedal was not needed, so this was replaced by a pedal that operated the wing depending on where you are on the circuit. For example, open for the straights and closed for the corners, very much like how DRS works in modern Formula 1. Remember, this was the 1960s. Hall wouldn't stop there though. He looked at other lift generating devices, which led to him looking at aircraft wings. Now if these wings are designed to generate lift, what would happen if we installed them onto a car with a negative setting angle so that the forces acting upon it go down rather than up? The Chaparral 2E appeared for the first time sporting a huge and extremely tall rear wing, which stunned all of their competitors. Once again, this wing was adjustable and operated by the driver in the cockpit. The two large struts holding the wing in place were actually attached to the suspension. This was done so that the load brought on by the downforce would be put directly onto the rear tyres, and thus dramatically increasing adhesion when cornering. The cars had a host of other dramatic advances in technology, including the first experiments with ground effect in motorsport. Many F1 drivers were competing in sports car racing as well, and were able to see the potential from these astonishing cars. Eventually talk of these developments would trickle down to Formula 1, and it wouldn't take long before engineers began to look into this brand new concept. At the 1968 Monaco Grand Prix, Lotus would turn up with an upgraded Lotus 49, which featured small winglets at the front and a wedge-shaped rear wing, with Graham Hill taking victory with the new Lotus 49B. This truly started a domino effect, and at the next race at Spa, Ferrari, McLaren and Brabham would arrive with wings attached to their cars, with McLaren choosing to adopt a similar design to Lotus. Brabham, however, copied the chaparral design with a large aerofoil high above the rear, attached to the suspension via 2 struts. Ferrari also took this design, but chose instead to attach the struts to the chassis. Enzo Ferrari, who previously disliked the idea of aerodynamics, once famously claiming that they were only for people who couldn't build engines, believed that having these huge wings mounted directly to the suspension was extremely dangerous, as the wings would shift side to side and flex under load, which was common for the bumpy nature of most public road courses such as Spa. Nevertheless, by 1969, most other teams had also adopted wings, and in some extreme cases, they would have 2 large wings mounted at the front and rear, making these cars resemble biplanes. Some drivers, though, were skeptical of the safety of these wings. One of them was the Austrian Jochen Rindt. An extremely quick driver who often took his cars above and beyond its limits in ways never seen before in Formula 1. Born in Germany in 1942, Rindt's parents were both killed during an Allied bombing raid on Hamburg in 1943, making Jochen an orphan at just 15 months old, leaving Jochen in the care of his grandparents in Graz, Austria. Described by his close friends as laddish and would often get into trouble in school as he was growing up, Jochen would begin driving a VW Beetle in 1960, but often got into trouble with the police due to his reckless driving on public roads. So much so, as his career progressed, he would become known amongst residents of Vienna for drifting through the city streets in his Jaguar E-Type. In 1961, Rindt and a number of his school friends, including Helmut Marko, travelled to the Nürburgring to watch the German Grand Prix that year, in particular Jochen's idol, Wolfgang von Trips. His interest in motorsport greatly increased after this, and by the end of the year he had already started to participate in local racing events, although his sometimes dangerous driving style did get him into a lot of trouble with race stewards on a few occasions. Jochen's success in junior categories led him to entering Formula 2 in 1964 and would go on to become one of the most successful drivers in the series, achieving 29 race wins by August 1970, gaining the unofficial title of King of Formula 2. He also famously beat Graham Hill to victory at Crystal Palace in 1964. Of course, this led to a drive in Formula 1 at the 1964 Austrian Grand Prix. The following year, he had a full-time drive for Cooper, and by 1964, he had already achieved his first podiums for the team. During this time, he became close friends with Jacky Stewart and would often go on holiday together, accompanied by their families. The Stewart and Rindt family lived almost next door to each other in Switzerland. Rindt also had close friendships with most of the grid at the time, but was amongst those ridiculed by the press for his support of Jacky Stewart's efforts to improve safety in the sport, becoming one of the leading figures in the Grand Prix Drivers Association. Rindt's career was also unofficially managed by Bernie Eccleston, who he had met during his time with Cooper. This partnership allowed Rindt's success to be promoted across Austria, and his popularity skyrocketed as motorsport became more and more popular. The Österreich Ring, now known as the Red Bull Ring and the Salzburg Ring, were built to cater for this demand, with Rindt acting as advisor. An unsuccessful spell with Brabham in 1968 led to a move that would most likely lead to Jochen becoming a world champion, as he signed for the Lotus team, who were still grieving from the loss of Jim Clark in April 1968. Whilst Colin Chapman admired Jochen and treated him like a son, Jochen didn't see it that way, and was uncomfortable to join Lotus due to the fragile nature of their cars. At Lotus, I can either be world champion or die. Citing that his relationship with Colin was purely business and not personal. For the second race of 1969, the grid headed to the Montjuic street circuit for the Spanish Grand Prix, a high downforce track with long flat out curves and tight hairpins, surrounded by crash barriers on both sides. Jacky Stewart detested the circuit, as its unprofessional organisation was evident when many barriers weren't correctly installed. Regardless, the race got underway with Jochen Rindt starting from pole and teammate Graham Hill starting from third. By the beginning of the 8th lap, Graham Hill found himself in the lead, and he prepared to tackle the fairly large bump on the track where cars would get airborne, which was located in the middle of a high-speed left-hander before the descent down to a hairpin. Hill prepared himself once again to take on this corner. It could have been his last. As Graham climbed the bump in the road, the rear wing on his Lotus collapsed, and with it, the downforce on the rear of the car went too, meaning that the car became uncontrollable in an instant. Graham was sent headfirst into the barriers at high speed, and his car continued to spin down the track before coming to a rest some several hundred feet down from where the wing failed. Graham Hill, though, was completely unharmed and quickly got out of his car, whereby he stood and worked with the marshals to clear the wreckage away. Graham wasn't aware of what had caused his accident, but on lap 20, the answer revealed itself to him. Jochen Rindt, who by this point was leading the race, approached the same spot where Graham crashed and tackled the bump in the road. But, as he did so, his rear wing also collapsed, sending him into the barriers in an identical fashion to Hill's accident. The only difference this time was that everyone witnessed the rear wing fail on Jochen's car before violently being thrown into the barriers at 140 miles per hour. The constant strain being put onto the wing struts were the probable cause of the failure. Rindt's Lotus also bounced from one side of the circuit to the other and hit Hill's stationary car still sat by the side of the track. Jochen's Lotus then flipped over, trapping Jochen inside the mangled wreck. As many people were still on site attending to Hill's accident, it didn't take long until people rushed to Jochen's aid. The car was righted, but Jochen's face was covered in blood as he suffered a broken nose, presumably from hitting the steering wheel from the sheer force of the impact. Jochen was rescued and taken to a nearby hospital where it was found that he luckily had no life-threatening injuries, but one nearby marshal lost an eye and another had his foot broken due to flying debris. As he recovered, Jochen publicly voiced his anger towards the rear wing design and in particular Colin Chapman. Rindt was suspicious of Lotus before this accident, but now he had no trust in them at all. After these two near identical accidents, the high rear wing was banned from Formula 1 and engineers began to come up with more sophisticated and safer chassis mounted wing designs from then on. As for Jochen Rindt, he reluctantly continued to drive for Lotus for the rest of the year and would eventually win his first Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, but Graham Hill experienced a terrible accident during this race which almost cost him his life, revealing once again the fragility of the Lotus designs. In 1970, Lotus would enter the now legendary Lotus 72 for the first time. Despite early teething troubles, Jochen Rindt would eventually find himself fighting Jacky Ickx and Jackie Stewart for the title. A title fight where Jochen's championship efforts would sadly come to an end at Monza, with a tragic conclusion.